Well, thank you, and thanks for being here. It's nice to have a nice sunny day. Coming from Alaska, I expected it to be nice and warm, and my wife said, "Oh, don't worry, it'll be great down there. You'll have great time. You need short-sleeve shirts and all of that." And I got here, and I'm like vibrating all day yesterday. Wes bailed me out and loaned me a coat, so at least I got halfway warm. But I am based in Alaska. I'll tell you a little bit more about my background. I'm married. I have 5 children. My youngest is 8. My oldest is 23. A lot of people say, well, when did you start having kids? When you were 10. I'm actually going to be 43 this year. I didn't have any gray hair until a couple of years ago when my middle kids started turning into teenagers, and that kind of threw me off. But nonetheless, usually people, if they've heard me on radio, and just for my own kind of idea of where we're at, how many have heard me on radio or seen me on CBC or television here? Okay. All right. How many have read some of my material then? All right. Okay. So I know kind of where we're at. Alaska's a really unique place. As a state, I think we're a lot closer to Canadians than we are to even our fellow countrymen in the lower 48 states. We're unique, as Canadians are, by being somewhat removed. In one sense from the mainstream, in another we're right plugged in. Alaska's infrastructure, was built really in the last 40 years over my lifetime. Before it was a territory, and all the things that are there that facilitate communications are probably some of the best in the world. The thing that got me involved in a lot of this work, I was involved heavily in education in Alaska. I was the president of the Alaska Federation of Teachers for 2 terms, the Anchorage Council of Education for a couple of terms. I worked in the school system about 10 years. My family is very political. My father was a state senator and later a United States congressman. My brother has been on the Anchorage Assembly. He was there for 9 years. My mother was National Committee woman for the Democratic Party a couple of terms. Everybody in my family is involved politically somewhere. For me, I always had an interest in science and technology. Eventually, I got a doctorate in traditional and complementary medicines. With an area of emphasis for me was electrophysiology, the effect of electromagnetic fields on the human body. And even though we got 2 hours and 40 minutes, I'm going to talk fast. So if you missed something, grab the tape. They said they'd have them ready 5 minutes later, right? And I want to say a couple things about this event. I go to a lot of different events, and the reporter asked me, do you go to outdoor events very often? And I started thinking about it, and really in the last 7 years, I think there's been maybe 3 or 4 times that I've done outside events. And aside from yesterday, this has been great. And even yesterday was great because the speakers were good. The subject matter was quite interesting to me. In all these kinds of events, we hear a lot of things. Some we agree with, some we just don't agree with. And what I would encourage people to do is, when you hear what I have to say, if you don't believe it, that's fine. Look up the sources. Anytime somebody asks you to change your behavior, change your life, change something about what you're doing, your perspective on life, I think they have an obligation to tell you why, to evidence it fairly, and then to provide people an opportunity to go look at that evidence themselves. So when you read our work, you'll see in almost every instance a series of footnotes, usually at the bottom of the page, so people can actually go and do that. We also have a threshold of evidence that we accept. It's got to be written, it's got to be documented. I won't take a word-of-mouth piece of testimony, and generally I won't integrate it into my work. Not that the person might not be accurate, it's just it's not easy to confirm, and that's just the standard that we have. Others have a lesser standard, but that's fine. When I look at technology generally, and when I started in this work, really began with the HAARP project, and I think a lot of people here have heard parts of that, and some of it's accurate out there, and some of it's inaccurate. When I look at the net these days, and I look up HAARP, there's hundreds and hundreds of sites that pop up. Some are quite accurate, and there's plenty of evidence to support what they say, and others are highly distorted in terms of how they view the system. But HAARP is a high-frequency active auroral research project, and because that's where I started, that's where we'll start today, and to kind of get people up to speed as to what that is. It is a joint project of the United States Air Force and Navy. It's operating in Alaska in a place called Gakona, which is about 250 miles northeast of Anchorage. And what the military did is secured a site and began to play with a large array, a field of antennas that produce radio frequency energy. And the array currently is about 48 antennas in a 6x8 grid. It'll eventually be 180, and perhaps, if they take it to the next phase, 360. What happens with this array is they fire the antennas in a sequence, and it's computer-driven, and that sequence causes what's called cyclotron resonance. where you actually get a corkscrewing kind of effect of that radio frequency energy, and as it goes higher and higher, it becomes narrowly focused to a relatively small area. Now, those of you that are engineers or have radio background generally follow this rule that as energy leaves the source, it dissipates very rapidly. It's like light leaving from a flashlight dissipates very rapidly. And radio frequency energy was thought to be exclusively the same. As we learned with lasers, you could actually focus light energy into a relatively narrow beam and hold that beam. With radio frequency energy, this particular invention by Dr. Bernard Eastland, he holds a number of patents on the technology. He was able to create this focusing effect. So by analogy, you could look at it similarly to what happens with light and a laser, in this case, radio frequency energy and HAARP, focusing that energy. Now, why is that important? A number of things have been observed, going way, way back, that if you could ever manipulate radio frequency energy in just the right way, get it up to this area called the ionosphere, which is a layer that begins about 30 miles above the Earth's surface and extends for several hundred miles out. If you could stimulate the ionosphere in very specific ways, you could create a number of different effects. For communications, for instance, the thing that allows us to communicate from via radio, shortwave, across the planet is the idea that a signal bounces off the ionosphere, comes back down. But the character of the ionosphere determines the quality of that transmission, the quality of that communication. And so by understanding the ionosphere and learning about the ionosphere, then we learn more about how to enhance our own communications, or perhaps how to deny an adversary the use of their communication systems, which was really where HAARP started, was the idea that here with this ability to send energy up, and the effective radiated power, the amount of energy delivered at the point in the ionosphere where they're trying to create the effect, when they finally finish the developmental prototype, it's 1 billion watts, a gigawatt of effective radiated power. Tremendous amount of energy. But by focusing the energy and changing the character of the ionosphere, what you can essentially do is create a number of things. And I'm going to go through the straight military things that show up in their own literature first, because I think those are easy to find and easy to deduce. One of the first things that they talked about was over-the-horizon radar, looking around the curvature of the Earth for incoming objects. And this is OTH, over-the-horizon radar, is actually the site in which HAARP is located, was the over-horizon radar site prior to the Cold War ending. It was to be the place where we built this. And then they abandoned it, they say, when the Cold War ended. And actually what they did is they abandoned old technology in favor of HAARP. But to build a facility that had over-the-horizon radar capability of the magnitude in which it was contemplated for HAARP, even as a developmental prototype, would have constituted a violation of the ABM Treaty. And the ABM Treaty, I think we've all probably heard a little bit about in the last couple of years, finally getting in the news because the Russians and the Chinese are upset, the Europeans are upset that we're going forward with missile defense unilaterally in the United States without modifying the treaty. And I'll talk a little bit more about that if I remember to as we go on today. But over-the-horizon radar, the problem with the old technology is as objects came in close, they became distorted. And particularly, when you really needed to know what those objects were and where they were headed, if they were in close, they would become distorted. The thing that this technology does that's different is it detects everything from intercontinental ballistic missiles, which are at very, very high elevations, all the way down to cruise missile heights, things coming in at very low elevations, and doesn't distort them as they come in close. So it's a much more superior over-the-horizon technology, looking around that curvature, then being able to follow all those objects in. One of the other things that was noted with HAARP was the idea that if you could increase the energy level of the transmitter, that it would interact with the objects that were coming in and create a field around them, and that was able to be read by satellite-based technologies. In fact, there's a cluster of 9 patents that we cite within the context of the HAARP book, and those patents were owned by a company, Arco Power Technologies, which was a subsidiary of Atlantic Richfield, or Arco Oil and Gas. This particular company was originally headed by Bernard Eastland. He was the one who originally staffed the whole crew. He's the same person that the military has said this isn't his technology. The fact is it is. We have letters from Arco, from one of their vice presidents, indicating quite clearly it was his. The reason the disconnect is one of his co-inventors on one of the patents was a gentleman, one of the founders of TRW, and was considered the father of Star Wars technology during the Reagan administration. The thing that that Star Wars couldn't deliver on, is the satellite-based technology. There were a number of problems with it at the time. One of the biggest problems was the stability of a satellite. Any of you have ever done carpentry work and you've been like a 1/16 of an inch out on one end of a very long distance, and you know what happens on the other end? You know, you're really out. Well, in satellites, there's always a certain amount of wobble. So if you're going to use like a very high-powered laser or something from a satellite, the odds of you hitting your target without being able to stabilize that satellite are pretty much nil. Only this year did they finally achieve the necessary breakthroughs for stabilization where satellite-based Star Wars systems might work. But during the interim, they started looking at ground-based systems. And this is where, if you go back 2 presidential elections ago, back when Dole was running, the very end of the election, he started talking about ground-based Star Wars technology, missile defense technology. And everyone kind of looked at him and goes, you know, what are you talking about? What he was talking about was essentially what was being developed at that point at HAARP. And Senator Ted Stevens, who's our senior senator from Alaska, up until a few months ago was chairing appropriations for the U.S. Senate, was really driving the funding for this project. And one of the things that had come up, and it was right shortly after the Gulf War, they started talking about the underground facilities that they were trying to find where they were storing chemicals and chemical weapons in Iraq. And one of the applications of HAARP is for a system called, or a technique for ground penetrating tomography. Ground penetrating tomography in plain language would be like looking into the earth, or would be equating it to an X-ray, only in this case using radio frequency energy. And the way that works, the energy goes up, hits the ionosphere, and by pulsing the high frequency signal, what happens is the ionosphere for up to 1,000 miles begins to vibrate in resonance with the pulse rate. And what that does is create a secondary wave of energy that comes down as an ELF, an extremely low frequency wave. And as that hits the Earth, it penetrates the Earth at depth, reflects a signal back that with instruments on the ground or traversing the ground, you can actually deduce what's under it. This was funded in 1995 under non-proliferation and counter-proliferation in the U.S. defense budget under the heading HAARP. And they had to prove that that would work before they would gain additional funding. They proved it would work, and they actually, one of their scientists spoke about their test results on a program called Horizons, which was aired by BBC back, I think it was 97 or 98. But basically they proved that that capability also existed. The other thing that was interesting is by creating that energy around those incoming objects, those ICBMs or their cruise missiles coming in, and using satellite-based gamma ray detectors, you could actually deduce which of the objects carried nuclear payloads and which of those were decoys. Now, why is that important? In a nuclear attack, the idea has always been that you would have thousands of these incoming objects, most of which would be neutrals. They wouldn't have anything on them, or they would have conventional warheads, and only a few would be real threats, nuclear threats. By being able to deduce which ones are the real threats and which ones are decoys, of course, you can see the value of that. You can take out the real targets and ignore the rest. And as missile defense has evolved, one of the things that has come out, and it's come out more recently, is this idea of ground-to-air missiles. And I laugh about it because most of the tests of this idea have failed, and the most recent test is, in my view, somewhat suspect just in the way in which it was portrayed to the public. But it's the idea of hitting a bullet with a bullet. You know, I mean, it just doesn't make a lot of sense. And when you think about a threat cloud, is what they call these up to thousands of these incoming objects, if they can't hit, 1 out of 6, what are the odds of hitting the right ones out of thousands? It's just not going to happen. But when we started looking at missile defense generally, one of the other things that we found with the HAARP transmitter is that if you could increase the power level even higher, you can create what's called an EMP, an electromagnetic pulse. The first time electromagnetic pulse was really viewed as a potential weapon was in the South Pacific in the 60s, when they were detonating in the upper atmosphere nuclear weapons. And what happened is a wave of energy came down and knocked power out in Hawaii for several hours. And they, and the thought was, that might be even more devastating weapon than the actual effect of the bomb hitting the target. And if you recall, back in the early 70s, there was a lot of discussion about the idea that if they could ever detonate a nuclear device high enough above the United States, it would knock out all of the electronics in the country. And and that was considered a serious threat because of satellite-based technologies and the idea that maybe that would be a delivery system that would cripple the defense mechanisms in the United States and Canada. So EMP becomes an important component because if you can deliver an EMP, an electromagnetic pulse of sufficient size, you can disrupt the electronics on a incoming object sufficiently to cause them to malfunction and crash. In fact, it's more likely that an energy weapon will be used as an interceptor as opposed to a missile, given the fact that that's what the literature is showing. I'm going to refer to my book a couple of times just because I want to make sure I get the numbers right. My memory is usually pretty good, but sometimes it slips. There was one particular patent that struck us, and it was in regards to energy weapons. In fact, it was owned and is owned by the U.S. Department of Energy, and it actually sends. Well, let me read the quote, and this will be a short one if I can find it quickly. This is directly out of this patent. The patent number is 4959559, and it was issued September 25th, 1990. And it's called Electromagnetic or Other Directed Energy Pulse Launcher. And it's owned by the United States of America, represented by the U.S. Department of Energy. And the U.S. Department of Energy is the follow-on folks. When you go back to the beginning of the U.S. Department of Energy, you have to go back to the Manhattan Project, which brought us the first atomic bomb. And so it's this department that really deals with new and exotic weapons. But this is what they talk about in this patent and what it's capable of. And it's funny because the equations that they give, what they equate it to is you'll find humorous, considering it's a U.S. government patent. And it says, the invention relates generally to the transmission of pulses of energy and more particularly to the propagation of localized pulses of electromagnetic or acoustic energy over very long distances without divergence. Meaning, in other words, it stays tightly packed. It's not like an acoustic wave that goes out and dissipates very rapidly, spreads out, the energy is basically gone with a very short distance. Or in the case of electromagnetic energy, the same thing, spreading out very rapidly and dissipating. In this case, staying together. Now, this is the way they say you'll visualize it, what you would see. And they use this analogy, and I quote, "As a Klingon battle cruiser attacks the Starship Enterprise, Captain Kirk commands, fire photon torpedoes, 2 darts or blobs of light speed toward their target to destroy the enemy spaceship. Stardate 1989, or Star Trek reruns, or 3189, somewhere in intergalactic space, fantasy or reality. The ability to launch localized packets of light or other energy which do not diverge as they travel great distances through space may incredibly be at hand." And then they go on to describe the patent itself. In fact, it is at hand in the ability of being able to do this. So what you would visualize is literally a balled form of lightning almost, a ball of energy traveling at just near the speed of light, 186,300 miles per second, versus a conventional warhead traveling between 15,000 and 30,000 miles an hour. So when you think about of energy exchange, you have this, first of all, this ball of energy that can travel at this incredible velocity to intercept an incoming ICBM, probably before it even leaves, significantly leaves the airspace of the country that's being launched out of, and be able to hit it with such kinetic force as to literally melt circuitry and destroy that object on contact. That is most likely what we're going to see in missile defense, something along this line or a similar line, as opposed to what you're hearing about in the mainstream right now. And this, remember, this patent is 11 years old. And to kind of put that into perspective, technology from the invention of the wheel to where we are today is doubling every 9 to 10 months. So what happened 11 years ago is would be like looking at the covered wagon to get here from the airport, which wouldn't have existed, right? So it's interesting that even within the Department of Energy, a great deal of emphasis is being placed on these types of weapons. In fact, you'll hear some of the folks in China and Russia are talking about energy weapons in sort of a veiled kind of way. You're not really getting the full story, but there's actually quite a bit coming out out of those countries. There was a couple of congressional reports that we ran into recently that were interesting in terms of China. In China's view, much of the technology we're talking about doesn't require the kind of infrastructure building that the nuclear industry required in order to bring intercontinental ballistics missiles. These systems are smaller, more compact, and much more deliverable. The things that start coming up and we start seeing is the idea that even unsophisticated states are gaining this capability. Third world countries gaining the capability of creating on a small scale electromagnetic pulse weapons. One of the big concerns is that one day someone's going to drive down Wall Street with one of these devices and knock out the computers that exist within, within that environment, which we can easily see would create some serious problems for the United States. And you're seeing a closer and closer scrutiny of exports in terms of high electronics for the same reason, because a lot of this stuff is a matter of buying the components off the shelf and configuring them. In fact, there was one guy in Los Angeles that was able to demonstrate an EMP weapon on a small scale. And this is another interesting quote, so I'll read it. The thing that he was doing is taking 2 car batteries, essentially, and using the energy from 2 car batteries and discharging it in a very, very short amount of time, in a fraction of a second. It created a tremendous surge of energy. And this is, let me find what he said exactly. Well, I thought I had it marked. Well, I can't find it right yet. But let me just describe what it says. Essentially, what he did is he took the energy of 2 car batteries, he discharged it in a fraction of a second, in just a fraction of a second, a fraction of a second meaning a nanosecond, 1/1000th of a second. And in doing so, releasing that amount of energy in that brief amount of time, he exceeded the electrical generating capacity of the United States by several times in that billionth of a second. But in doing so, anything within the range of that device, from a toaster oven to a sophisticated computer, would have been out, fried. It would have disrupted the flow of information through those computers and totally disrupted the programming. At a high enough energy level, it could have created even more damage in terms of even affecting diodes, melting diodes, and so on. But this is the technology that this guy built in a garage, a technician built in the garage, the same kind of technician that exists all over the planet. In fact, there's several of you guys sitting in this room right now with the capability of being able to do that. And essentially, that is one of the big things behind many of the new weapons technologies, is it's not the standard approach to affecting physical objects with ordnance, things blowing up, tearing things apart, bullets passing through tissue. It's affecting them in a different way. And we are, as technologically advanced countries, are the most vulnerable to these new technologies. I mean, folks that are existing on old technology are not so sensitive to electronic circuits. The old vacuum tubes, which are used still in many of the former Soviet Union military defense systems. There's good reasons for that, and one of them is they're not vulnerable, as vulnerable to this type of weapon, and in fact, most of them are impervious to it. A lot of effort has been spent developing technology to shield from EMP. But when we go back to HAARP, over-the-horizon radar, the ability to look around the horizon to see what's coming in. Secondly, the ability to distinguish between those objects to decide which are your real targets. And third, with enough energy to be able to destroy those targets. And then ground-penetrating tomography. Those are the 4 things that jumped out immediately in all of the literature regarding HAARP produced by the military. The other thing was communication with submarines. And communication with submarines have been at depth when they're down deep, getting through that ocean, through the ground. Short wavelengths don't penetrate very deep. You need a long wave to get down deep enough to create the communication, to facilitate the communication. Now, in the past, the way that's been done is with antennas buried under the ground. Many of you probably remember some of the controversy in Wisconsin and Michigan when they were burying back in the 70s these 14-mile and 26-mile long antennas under the ground to generate an ELF, an extremely low frequency signal for submarine communication. It caused a lot of concern by a lot of people for lots of different reasons, but they eventually deployed that system and deployed several others around the world. And the intent was to basically facilitate that communication. But if you can create the same kind of ELF by modifying the ionosphere, first of all, you don't need the buried antennas. You have a more versatile system. What they also found is that you could communicate at much higher data rates using a system such as HAARP. So underwater communications, or being able to communicate with submarines at depth, was another major concern of the military. 2 other things that come out, and this quote I know I can find, that are interesting. is the idea of what other things can happen with electromagnetic energy and its interaction with physical systems. And this quote is from the Department of Defense in the United States. It's a quote by the previous Secretary of Defense, William Cohen, and he made the quote April 28, 1997, when commenting at a conference on terrorism and weapons of mass destruction at the University of Georgia. And this is what he said, and I quote, "Others are engaging even in an eco-type of terrorism whereby they can alter climate, set off earthquakes and volcanoes remotely through the use of electromagnetic waves," unquote. Using energy as the trigger. And if you think about weather systems and the idea of triggering changes in the weather using electromagnetic means, it's not really such a new concept. In fact, in the former Soviet Union, there was a lot of research done in this area. If you remember a few years ago when they had the big fires in Indonesia and the smoke was blowing into Malaysia, there was a press report, and it's quoted in our book, where the Soviets, actually then the Russians, had offered the Malaysians the creation of an artificial cyclone to blow the smoke out of their country. I don't know whatever happened with it, but it did make the media. The other thing that happened is we started looking at weather modification. That goes back a long ways. It goes back really into the late 50s, early 60s. There was a lot of emphasis during the Vietnam War because weather conditions had a tremendous effect on whether or not we could fight in that environment. So weather modification became important. The things that most people remember are things like cloud seeding, where they put chemicals or compounds in the cloud formations to either cause rain to fall or to try and keep it from falling. There were a number of programs operated out of China Lakes, California in the early 70s along this same line. And the science was advancing pretty rapidly. By the mid-70s, it was getting to a very high state. In fact, it was the former Soviet Union that initiated the treaty dialogue that led to a treaty in 1977 forbidding the use of weather modification or what they call geophysical manipulation, manipulating elements of the planet, such as creating tidal waves, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, weather modification. These things were outlawed by international treaty in 1977. The U.S. is a signatory to that treaty, along with Russia and 60 other countries. When you look at the context of the time, most people think, the things that we've seen recently, disarmament treaties and chemical and biological weapons treaties, and yet what was so compelling in 1977 to get everyone to the table to sign off on that one? It was the fact that we could do it, and the fact that they could do it, and the reality set in that if you start triggering these kinds of events, it will quickly go out of control, and there's no way to really forecast what might be the downstream effect of some small localized effect. And so it was outlawed by international treaty. In the last, probably the last 10 years, we've seen at least 3 of the last 4 secretaries of defense start to move to reopen that treaty on the basis that controlling the environment within a battle field is absolutely strategically extremely valuable to anyone engaged in war. Fortunately, it hasn't happened yet. Although, as we've seen with the ABM treaty dialogue, the United States is not so concerned about whether or not everyone else is on board. What happened with the missile defense is kind of interesting. Is we were speaking in Europe, and we were asked to attend a hearing in the European Parliament, and they flew us over to really debate NATO on the issues of HAARP and missile defense. And when we came over, it was February 5th, 1998, and we were testifying in a subcommittee of the Foreign Affairs Committee. It was the Security and Disarmament Committee. And we had been asked to debate NATO, and NATO refused to show up. They had contacted the Secretary General of NATO. The Foreign Affairs Chair, Tom Spencer, had contacted him directly, and NATO's position was, we have no policy on ionospheric modification, the stuff of HAARP, and we have no policy on non-lethal weapons, and therefore we're not going to appear. Now, this really incensed the committee, because this is the same committee that they came before when they were trying to get the Europeans to acknowledge and accept additional member states to NATO. So it was convenient for them, but it was no longer convenient for NATO, so they wouldn't appear. They sat in the back during the hearing, and I don't think they really realized is we had been there on 4 other occasions, working with, lobbying really, people on the committee and people within the European Parliament. We had delivered over 3 feet of documents over 4 trips to Europe. They told us before we came that NATO was not going to appear, but they did sit in the back of the hearing room. The night before the hearing, we had 5.5 hours with the committee members. We went into a restaurant. Everybody got thrown out except for us. We had 5.5 hours to really go through the issues. So they would be equipped to ask the questions into the record the following day. Now that's much different than it happens in the United States. That kind of a closed meeting in the United States would have not been legal. In Europe, it's common. It's the way their politics is done. The next day when we went to the hearing, we opened the hearing. We were supposed to have 15 minutes. They gave me an hour and a half. We opened the hearing with a document, and it was called Ionospheric Modification for Weapons Application. It was produced by NATO France, and that's what we opened the hearing with. Now, hooked to that was the main lead scientist on that project, was also one of the lead scientists on the HAARP program. In fact, he was a major contributor to both projects. And the other thing we produced was a Strategic Studies Institute report talking about the deployment of non-lethal weapons by NATO in Europe. And what we suggested to the Europeans and to the Parliament was that if indeed they had no policy on either of these systems, then they had no business deploying them. And that it was irresponsible to do so. And it was either that or they were not being truthful with the committee. In either case, fundamentally, they were flawed. When we were there, we also demonstrated a couple of devices, a couple of things that were curiosities. One of them was an infrasound device. This is a device that was rumored in the literature. I mean, it had been heard about. There were some things in the Strategic Studies Institute about it. There was apparently, at one time, there was a device captured during the Vietnam War that was used for interrogating American prisoners. It was developed in Russia. And what it would create is a trance-like state using electromagnetic fields that would basically cause prisoners of war to fall into that state where they could easily extract intelligence from them. This device was captured in the mid-'60s. It was analyzed to death by our military, but they never really released it to the public. We took a working model of a device, an infrasound device, to the European Parliament, and as a consequence, one of the things that came out in their resolution when it did pass was a call for international treaty dialogue to bar any technology that would affect or interact with the human brain in any way. And I think that was important, again, because to get a political body to rise to the occasion of taking that kind of an issue on, you have to produce a lot of evidence. I mean, they do not take risks. You know, I grew up in a political family. My dad did take a few risks. He's not on the planet anymore, unfortunately. But the fact is, most politicians won't take those kinds of risks without a huge body of evidence. And we were able to produce that and a working model. Going back to HAARP for a moment, one of the things that had come out early in one of Bernard Eastland's patents was the idea that this might be used for weather modification. And the question is, well, how could that be? One of the things the military used to call these kinds of instruments ionospheric heaters, because they would literally heat a portion of the ionosphere and cause it to lift. With HAARP, what you can essentially do is you can heat an area about 30 miles in diameter, and you can cause it to lift as much as 200 miles out, which creates more or less a column of space. That space is filled with the atmosphere below it. And as a consequence, you can alter pressure systems within the region. You can slew the beam on a 30-degree arc, meaning you can move it and swing it. So you can do this repetitively in very quick succession and allow atmosphere to move in, change pressure systems, alter the course of jet streams, again using technology that's ground-based. This, you know, and I'll say this is a coincidence because there's no real evidence to connect the two, but it's an interesting coincidence nonetheless. You say, well, what difference does it make? What happens in Alaska? How's it going to affect the rest of us? Well, I think most people here know that Alaskan weather does affect us all down here in this part of the world. But as an example, do you remember a couple years ago, actually several years ago now, there were tornadoes that appeared in Orlando that were like totally unexpected. They weren't supposed to be there. It's just not supposed to happen. If you look at the May issue of Scientific America, it's the April-May issue, I believe, from last year, 2000, there's an article, the whole thing is dedicated to weather, the whole issue. But in there, they talked about those tornadoes. And they were originally supposed to occur in eastern Texas and Louisiana, places where you would normally see them. What happened is the jet stream was altered, not down there, but in Alaska. A slight dog leg appeared in the jet stream, and they actually have a map of the state and show where it is. And it happens to exist coincidentally right above the HAARP facility. And I say coincidentally because there is no clear correlation of whether they had the thing fired at that moment or not. The point being that very slight movement, and it was only maybe less than 100 kilometers of distance was moved, but it caused, again, it's that little bit of distance on one end creating a huge change on the other, and it literally moved those storm fronts out of Louisiana and East Texas into central Florida, depositing tornadoes there. Now, I say coincidence again because I want to make that really clear. It is just a coincidence unless you can quantify it scientifically, and we've not seen that quantification yet. But again, it can happen with this facility in this location, and it is capable at its current power level of creating that effect. One of the other things that comes up in the literature, and this one we're going to talk a lot about as we go on today, the idea of electromagnetic energy having effect on what goes on between the ears, what happens in the brain. And there hasn't been a lot at this conference on this subject, but I think it's important to get into it a bit. And there's a lot in the HAARP book about the idea that electromagnetic fields can have a tremendous effect on what happens in the brain, human behavior and mental processes, and just physiological effects as well. I'll give you an example. Light energy is thought to be relatively harmless. Say the light energy coming off of a television screen, if you're sitting a decent distance away, harmless, right? Not going to hurt you, not going to do anything to you. Do you remember a few years ago in Japan, 700 kids went to the hospital with epileptic seizures from the flicker effect? It's not the amount of energy, it's the pulse rate, the frequency in which the energy is delivered. And what happened is they were watching a cartoon on television. At one point, the sequence created a flicker effect that was at a very specific window frequency that triggered an epileptic seizure in 700 children. Now, if you have epilepsy, they'll tell you, don't go into a room with strobe lights flashing because it'll trigger seizures. For most people, it's not a problem, but within certain window frequencies, for a great number of people, more so than most realize, it is a problem. The idea that the brain will lock on to an external signal and begin to mirror it is really the theory behind that. And if you've looked at, there's quite a bit now out on light and sound devices that create a number of effects, the light devices that have a flicker effect. And what happens is within a certain range, and I'll cover the range just to kind of get everyone up to par. You've got brain activity, predominant brain activity in the human being is between 1 and say 30 hertz predominantly. Now what does that mean? Hertz, cycles per second, pulses per second, vibrations per second. Interchange them any way you want to, but essentially you'll get the idea. It's a vibration or a pulse. On the electrical grid that we use in our homes, it's 60 cycles per second, 60 pulses per second, vibrations per second. The brain, in the very, very deepest states of sleep, you'll run what's called a delta frequency, about 1 to 4 hertz, pulses per second. In the theta state, which is the next state, which is that state of sleep where you're sort of awake, sort of asleep, you're aware you're there, but you're not really. You know that state, right, as you're drifting off? That's a theta state. Interestingly enough, this is where most children are between the ages of about 3 and 5 years old. Predominant brain activity in children in that age is theta. And this is where they're learning language, social customs, all kinds of things, and they're also kind of, I don't know, I got 5 kids, so, they're sort of there and they're not there. It's that kind of a stage, and you never can figure out, you can't get their attention. It's because you're not going to get their attention as long as that mental state is there. That's just not their nature. They're there to learn different things in a different way, and that particular brain activity is conducive to what children need to learn at that stage. In fact, really up until about 7, we screw it up when we send them to school, and we focus them in a different way, and they lose that. But essentially then the next area is running theta is about 4 to say 7 hertz more or less. 7 to say 12 hertz more or less is your alpha range, and then above that is beta. Now alpha range is interesting. The alpha range is the range of the brain that is the most conducive to learning experiences. Interestingly enough, the Earth's resonance, which is called Schumann's resonance, 7.83 hertz, discovered in Germany in the 1950s. The pulse rate of the planet happens to hit right in the middle of that, the lower end of that alpha range. And that's an interesting correlation from my perspective, because I see a lot of linkages between, what have we done to ourselves as human beings. We tend to operate under high stress all the time. Where you are when you get above the alpha ranges, you're in beta. Right now, if we're all awake, we're in bed. If I have put anybody to sleep, we know where they're at, somewhere down there. I don't see anyone sleeping, so I think we're okay. The place where you get when you're angry is the high beta states, 30 hertz and above. That's where you're angry, you're agitated, things aren't working well. If you look at brain activity in terms of what happens within the human brain, when you're angry, fearful, experiencing any of the negative emotions, you plug into an EEG, what are you going to see? You're going to see very incoherent brain patterns. You're going to see a whole mix of activity but no rhythmic coherence. On the other hand, you flip it around and you're focused, you're concentrating, you're experiencing the better emotions, love, compassion, those things. You see a very rhythmic pattern in the EEG. What it tells you is that when you're in a state of fear, paranoia, if you're worrying about a lot of things, you're not going to be able to think clearly, you're not going to make good decisions, which explains a whole lot about what happens in the world when we find ourselves in those conditions. We are surrounded by energy constantly, and that energy has an effect on us whether we recognize it or not. And I'll tell you the best place to recognize it. Next time you have a power outage, I assume that you have those here in Canada as well. Next time you have a power outage, what's the first thing you notice? Quiet, right. Next time the power goes out, don't think about the quiet, think about the sensation on your body. Because most people feel this kind of an exhale, almost a relaxing sense. The same sense you get when you get out in the country. Your whole body relaxes. And the reason that is your body has to compensate for external fields constantly to maintain its equilibrium. So you're always under a certain level of stress by having to compensate on a subtle level with every energy interaction that you're exposed to. And by way of example, radio frequency energy from the time radio was invented, a little over 100 years ago, 200 million times more radio frequency energy in the natural environment than nature actually provided us 100 years ago. So just that one narrow portion of the spectrum we're inundated with it. But that constant compensation breeds a certain level of stress. It has a great deal to do with our overall health. At the same time, if you can drive the brain into specific frequencies and specific brain states, then you can even accelerate your capacity. I'll tell you a place where this is being used extremely effectively. And I heard one of the speakers earlier today talking about, or I guess it was a question actually, on ADD, attention deficit disorder children, and whether or not this device up here would be effective for that. And I think probably not, but because it's not viral or bacterial necessarily, although maybe there are some cases where it might be. But in the case of brains of children that are functioning either at this slower level, staying down in theta and they're not able to get up into those levels where they can really concentrate and learn. And on the other hand, you've got kids that are hyperactive that are way out here, high beta, can't calm down enough to focus and learn. So what do? They drug them, calm them down, numb them down a bit so they can focus. And for many kids, it's quite effective. The problem is they're overprescribed and there's other alternatives. And one of the best alternatives that's out there now is the idea of brain biofeedback. And 7, 8 years ago when I first started talking about brain biofeedback, neurobiofeedback, it was pretty much discounted. At the place I'm staying, I was glancing at a Reader's Digest, which is about as mainstream as you can get, right? Now they talk about brain biofeedback, so I think that's interesting, and in specific use for ADD children. And I thought that was interesting. It's like when I travel, you pick stuff up, and it sort of falls in front of you, and you look and you go, well, at least it's finally here, it's better late than never. But this is an incredibly useful technique for children, because what you basically do is you put them in front of a computer screen. Depending on the age of the child, they might use like a bouncing ball on the screen, and by hooking them up to either an 8 or a 16-channel EEG that's plugged directly into the computer, they're able to learn how, by manipulating their brain activity, move the ball around. Now, after 30 sessions to 40 sessions of an hour apiece with a trained clinician, they don't need the hardware anymore, and they can narrowly modify their brain activity into that learning band because they learned how to do it. They've mastered it. Something that would take someone, say, studying meditation techniques to achieve the same thing might spend 20 years to achieve what you can now teach a kid to do in 30 to 40 days.